Hi everybody, what's going on? Welcome to Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Today we're joined by director Nancy Schwartzman. Nancy, your new documentary, Roll Red Roll, it was unbelievable. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. So it was 4 years in the making, and you think back to the Steubenville rape case, 2012, 2013. So first of all, how did this all come together, and what was it like unpacking this crazy story?
Yeah, I mean the story, what we wanted to do was really just show a lot of different perspectives, and it's like a whole town, and because it's a small town, the crime really impacted and affected so many people. So there were so many avenues to explore and different kind of players and subjects to talk to. But what initially drew me to the story was all of the social media. For me, what's interesting and what I feel like is important is that we look at the boys' behavior and like the perpetrators and bystanders, because so often with rape cases it's like all hinging on the victim.
Right.
Like, oh well, what did she do, and tell us about her.
Victim blaming. Yeah.
Victim blaming, or even just our knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, okay, it's about sexual violence, well this is for women.
Right.
And I'm like, wait a minute, let's take a step back and actually look at behaviors we're all kind of familiar with. We all went to high school. Yep. Many of us went to college, right? It's like, what are these behaviors that we think are normal and acceptable, like how situations are planned and how victims are sort of cornered and isolated and how boys are kind of working in cahoots with each other. Like all of that played out so clearly in the Steubenville case.
Yeah, and just thinking about how we raise our young men and just being a man today, and this is obviously pre-Me Too, but so many things that could have been done to avoid this situation, and so many people that were around there that were just enabling this behavior. So what was most fascinating to you about not only the boys that were involved in this situation, but just, the boys in the video and just the way, the laughing and the way that they talked about rape? I mean, it was really startling to see all that video, and just, it was cringeworthy to watch that all again. So what did you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like it was really important to show it in how stark and clearly as I could, because I think a lot of times we sort of minimize things, like, oh, well, it wasn't a big deal and we should just like move on, or it wasn't, excessively violent, so it's not that bad. But actually, like, laughing about a rape is that bad.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Staring, being in a room with someone who's in distress and
taking
not
pictures.
doing anything, like that stuff's really bad. So I think it's important for us to see how like desensitized our culture is making us.
It's pretty scary to think about that, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just one angle to it. And then you mentioned the whole social media thing. So it's that, the boys are tweeting about it. There's pictures on Instagram. Anonymous comes into the picture and really blows this thing out, which I had totally forgotten about. So it just was the time and place it happened, plus social media. How did social media just transform this whole case?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It was a sort of perfect storm.
Yeah.
It's like 2012, so everybody's, Twitter, I'll get on it, and I'll use it.
Using it for the first time,
but it's private. It's like my phone.
Right.
I mean, kids are sort of using it as if it's a private communication. And then that intersected with Alex Goddard, who's our protagonist, who's an amateur crime blogger, really into true crime, like a lot of women, actually, but also really savvy about social media. So she was the one who had this foresight to look into their Twitter accounts, say, oh, whoa, football players are actually getting in trouble for something. That's kind of intense, like, because she knew the community. And then she knew also to save it and archive it before it got deleted. And she took that stuff seriously. She knew where to look, she knew where to find it. At that point, law enforcement wasn't really paying attention to tweets. They're like, well, that's the internet. What does the internet have to do with the real world? And what's so amazing about Anonymous is, like, Anonymous is this entity out there on the internet, and it just like intersects with this brick and mortar town in this really fascinating way.
Yeah, it was crazy. And even Alex's role in all this, because without her, this doesn't get the same light. You're not doing the documentary, most likely. And, she obviously receives death threats. And you think about the impact of media, whether it's somebody like her, or somebody like TMZ, and exposing stuff. Like, there's a lot of uncomfortable things that happen that people need to know about, and she suffered the brunt of it. But how important was she in just this whole story unfolding?
I think Alex was really, really important, because also with rape, when we talk about it, so often it's like, okay, well, it's for the criminal courts and the police are handling it and there's nothing to see, like they're gonna take care of it.
Right.
But actually, I think what she exposed was the culture. And it's like, well, the police, they're not educators. You know, they're not in charge of like raising our kids, and they're not coaching our kids into being better men and better women, right? So we can't just rely on the police for this. So what she showed us was like, how the culture was just normalizing everything. The other thing that she did that I think is really important was there was a photo going around of the victim, and she took the care and protection to pixelate and protect her. And I think that's really just like an act of love and an act of care that she did. But she also really weighed like, you know, do I expose this story? Is that harmful, or is that for the greater good?
Right, because she has to relive it, but we're having this conversation, and years later, we're still having this conversation.
Yeah.
So I liked how she was delicate about it, but at the same time, you do have to put this out there, and you do have to expose some things that are tough to see and tough to talk about.
And it opened floodgates for a lot of local women, right?
Right, with Anonymous there, when they're having that was one of the most profound moments of documentaries, is everybody telling their story in this moment, because, and this is pre-Me Too also, and just to be able to have the confidence finally after 10 years, 50 years, I mean, that was really, really fascinating to watch that unfold too.
Yeah, that's sort of what we call the heart of the film, because we wanted to make a thriller and make it in this like true crime genre where it's like you're following these pieces of evidence and it's kind of hitting you in the gut with like the visceral text messages and kind of teen energy, but it needed a heart, and that was the heart. And like, I don't think without those masks, even the option of putting them on, local women wouldn't have felt like they could speak their truth.
No, not in that small town, because you interview other people and they have the boys will be boys, or when I was in school, this was just being naughty, but you know, like in that town, it's really very old school. Even like the radio host that you pump throughout there, it's that he's kind of what people are thinking in the town at the time, and it's not the norm to be able to share your story. So to have those masks and just to unmask this conversation, that was a really interesting parallel there.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad it
definitely hit home. Yeah.
Good.
I think another really interesting moment, just a gut check moment, was the court scene with Trent and Malik, and just the way that they both approached the situation, and Malik breaking down and crying and saying, "I'm sorry," and Trent apologizing for just the pictures and not the act. Did you think of anything when you were putting that all together, just in the way that they apologized, or just the way that they both went about it?
Yeah, I think it's important to show the contrast. Certainly what it looks like to show remorse and be a kid and make a terrible mistake and have to be accountable for your mistake, which is Malik, and weeping is a perfectly human response to what happened. And I think it evoked, you know, I've shared this film quite a bit on the festival circuit, and people are like, I felt bad for him, and I feel strange that I feel bad. It's like, no, we should have compassion.
Right, this is a human being, and he made a horrible mistake, and he did something he shouldn't have done. But at the same time, he clearly realizes the magnitude of it, and he realizes how he hurt that girl as well, and her family. And that's very clear, whereas Trent, it's a much different reaction to the whole story.
Yeah, it's pretty chilling, right? It's very sort of, I'm gonna cover my bases and say a few things. I think it's important, you know, the Attorney General, the prosecuting attorney, Marianne Hemmeter, in the case, really made a point to talk about patterns of predation. Like, how does a kid learn to be so predatory? This is a, you know, by all external appearances, like a good kid, right? Like, good in school, athlete, middle class. Like, where is he learning to sort of be that calculating? And, you know, she felt it was important to point it out, like, you know, so I think watching that go down in the courtroom is pretty stark.
Definitely, and it just really makes you think about, what do we celebrate in male culture? You know, for so many years it's been the conquest of women and sexual achievements, and that's not what should be celebrated, not at all. And really this helps you to refocus that conversation and just to think, how do we change things going forward? Because, you know, these were kids that could have had a much different life if they don't make these decisions. And so I guess the bigger question for you is, how do we start to make moves in saying that this is wrong and we're going to build from this. So what do you think we can do there?
Well, I love that you say that about like masculinity and how it's been structured.
Yeah, and there's so much of that in our life today, but especially in this story here.
Yeah, I mean, so we designed the film to really make that clear, and I especially sort of crafted this film for men to be affected by it, and for young men especially to take a look at it and see themselves. And we can all see ourselves in the film. We all went to high school in the United States, most of us, right? So it's like looking at that and saying, oh my God, we were born into this culture, doesn't mean we have to keep upholding it and repeating it. So a lot of what we're doing with the film is working with men who work with athletes, or men who are athletes who are actively challenging the culture and like being proactive about naming it. Because like we women, so many of us have been doing this for a long time.
Long time.
Saying, please care, please understand. And actually it's really like time to pass the baton over to guys who want to make a difference about it.
And I've talked about this with my fiance, that women have done such great work, but the real change is when men are going to come into the picture. And it shouldn't have to be like that, but that's kind of where we are as a society, and having better role models. And just also like in the doc, you guys define what rape is, what consent is, because that's still something that people don't understand.
Yeah.
And even, you have the one lawyer in there who's saying, well, if you give access to the phone, then that's consent. And you're like, wait a minute, no, that's not consent. If somebody is unable to utter the words yes or is incapacitated, you can't move forward with things. So I think from a filmmaking perspective, it must have been interesting, like we have this really complex issue. We need to actually just simplify things and define things. So how did you go about breaking things down so simply throughout the documentary?
Well, it was really important that we didn't have any outside experts come in and define consent or talk about rape and tell you what it is. So it's always wonderful when someone in your film does that for you. So in this case, it's the lead detective explaining to the football coach the definition of rape and consent. I was like, I'm just gonna step back and let you guys do it, right? So it's like when a man can tell another man the definition of rape, like we're done, like that's great. Another scene like that felt really important was during a police interview when one of the officers is yelling at this kid to be a man. Be a man. That means this and that means that, and it's like so intense. And I think that scene, in a way, that's a kid. He's 17, right? And what does it mean to be a man? And this guy's using manhood as a kind of weapon. And I think like that scene is so important for educators to be able to use. So you kind of look for those gems, because the last thing you want to do is like explain things to people or tell them something.
Right, hit them over the head with it.
We were telling a story, right? So we're crafting it as how a true crime would sort of unfold with all these like pieces of evidence and going from one location to another and on a sort of linear basis, getting up to the trial and the aftermath. But it really was a question of like, what are the nuance layers that you add in to give you a feel for the town and give you a feel for the language and the atmosphere? Because the atmosphere is as important as the details of the crime.
Yeah. You really need to know where it happens and what's going on just during that time to understand really the full magnitude of the story there. So for sure. Yeah. If you could talk to Trent and Malik, what are some questions that you would want to know the answers to?
Well, I'd love to know if they are, being held accountable every day, because we all sort of need to check ourselves every day. If they have people in their lives who are making sure that they're very clear about what happened and what the definitions of respectful behavior are, and that they're, getting help from people who take this issue seriously. Yeah. To show that they're kind of making positive changes in their life. I think what happens to a lot of people, especially athletes, if they do their time, they get out, and then they're sort of protected again in the same exact environment. Where it's like, okay, you did that, you're fine, keep going, essentially, and then the message is nothing needs to change, but actually something does really need to change. Like, what is your behavior? Do you have a community of people that helps hold you accountable, where you're challenging masculinity, where you're challenging your own biases? Like, we all need it.
Absolutely.
And
that's the only way we grow.
Yeah. So I'm, that's a concern.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the Ray Rice case from a few years ago, and there was somebody whose caught in doing a horrible thing, but somebody who is attempting to grow and to learn and is never going to be in a situation where you can be fully forgiven for something like that. But someone that's actually actively taking the steps where I'm sure you've seen it in your years of work, is that somebody is accused of doing something, somebody is guilty of doing something, and then they just try and go back to life as if it were totally normal.
Right.
And you can't do that. That's
no, I mean,
life.
if you have the capacity, we all have the capacity to do bad things.
Right.
You know, these aren't good kids and bad kids, right? Anyone has the capacity to harm another if we're not careful. So where are we getting our messages? How are we making sure that we're in alignment and trying to shift our behavior? Whether that's in your religious community, whether it's your coach, whether it's a mentor or advocate or whatever. There's lots of great people that can help you check yourself.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about boys and men when they watch this doc. When you think about young girls who interviewed, women in general, when they watch the documentary, what are the big things you want them to take away thinking?
You know, I like to say that I didn't really make this film for girls and women. So often the messaging around this topic is,
like you said about them.
Girls, here's what you do to avoid being raped. And actually, that's basically saying we live in a rape culture and we're not actually addressing the problem.
Right.
So I think we all need to be compassionate. As teenage girls, we can be really hard on each other. And that's something I think it's important to see how teen girls can also hold up rape culture by policing other young women, right? So we need to support each other and not be part of this system that's really harmful to everybody. Yeah,
no doubt about it. And I really feel like this Steubenville case changed how we talk about rape in culture. And just kind of bringing things forward. And then you pair that with the Me Too movement and thinking about that on a much larger scale. So when you think about it, I mean, between this case and the Me Too movement the last couple of years, what has it been like for you to kind of see some things change and see some things that still aren't changing, but what's been most profound over the last couple of years to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so many amazing changes over the past couple of years. Just to watch this groundswell of stories come up, and suddenly you can't argue with that kind of volume. You know, suddenly it's like, whoa, the internet, hashtag, look at all of these stories, and we're seeing, these titans fall, and as they should. If you've raped 81 women, whether you're Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby, your time is up, and that's, I think what we were living with was, were these open secrets, right? Like, well, everybody knows that Harvey Weinstein does that.
Right, and they were talking about it under the table, but again, enablers, bystanders, not actually putting it into it. Yeah, R. Kelly as well. And even with this situation, a couple months before this case, there's another situation. And if that had been dealt with properly, who knows if this ever happened? So timing is everything, and making the right decisions in that moment. And sometimes we're not prepared to deal with that, but now we have the blueprint of years and years and years of what not to do and what to do. And I think your documentary speaks to both of those things.
Oh, great. Yes, definitely what not to do, for sure. And then how we can move forward and heal and acknowledge and not participate in this without taking a step back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when can people check this out?
Well, this weekend we open at the Film Forum in New York City. We have a 2-week run. We'll be in Los Angeles April 5th in Santa Monica, and then we are the season opener on PBS's POV channel.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I highly recommend for everybody to check it out. Nancy, absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.